Well, good evening, everybody. It's great to see you. I'm Paul Fanlon, publisher of the Capital Times, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this, the 7th annual Cap Times Idea Fest. Thanks for being here. This is the first of several nights, plus multiple sessions on Saturday, that we'll present in this great theater space. So we hope we'll see you back here on multiple nights the rest of the week. We have a really outstanding program this year. We've been looking forward to tonight's session since early summer. We were brainstorming how Cap Times Idea Fest might connect to the UW-Madison's big anniversary, and we landed on the very timely topic of free speech on campus. So that's our title tonight, Free Speech at UW-Madison, 175 years of sifting and winnowing. Before we get to the program, I'd like to thank our sponsors who make Idea Fest possible, starting with our presenting sponsor again this year, Epic Systems. Our other major sponsors are Exact Sciences and HealthX Ventures, and I'm going to name the rest of our sponsors for a moment: Madison Gas and Electric, Alliant Energy, Ascendium Education Group, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Godfrey Kahn Law, Kessenix, University Research Park, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Cargo Coffee, Leopold Bar, Books Bar Cafe, Madison College, where we were last night, Forward Theater, and Youngblood Beer Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, and Civic Media. When you think of the Cap Times, we hope you think of an independent, locally owned institution that's part of the fabric of Madison. One that provides strong local news and cultural coverage, thought-provoking progressive opinion, and major community philanthropy through our EVU Foundation. You know, I noted that we're regular contributors to many programs on campus. I counted 31 that the EVU Foundation is supporting just this year. So if you're not already, we would hope that you might consider becoming a Cap Times member. So onto the program. We're going to have note cards to pass out, and if you'd like to put questions on, we'll bring them up here, give them to David Maraniss, our moderator, and he will get to the ones he has time for. So you can look for that. We're so thrilled to have Chancellor Jennifer Mnookin to our stage. She is UW-Madison's 30th Chancellor, and as most of you know, arrived in Madison last year after having served as the Dean of Law at UCLA. We're also delighted to have Paul Soglin, who, as most of you also know, was mayor of Madison for 22 years, and in his earliest Madison years was immersed in campus free speech as a Vietnam protester. And it's great to have our third panelist, Dan Takaji, UW's Dean of Law, who counts free speech among his many areas of expertise. This is the perfect panel, we thought, for this discussion. I'd like to just note on the side that the Cap Times has a connection to Dan. He holds the chair that's endowed by Fred and Vi Miller. Fred was the president, longtime president of the Capital Times Company. Finally, we welcome back as moderator David Maraniss, the Washington Post journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner, and decorated author. The Capital Times has no better friend than David, and many of us remember the legendary Cap Times leadership provided us by his late father, Elliot Maraniss. One of David's many books, and I imagine there are quite a few in the audience who've read this book, one of his books is especially apropos for this evening with its Madison and University of Wisconsin focus. Its title, of course, They Marched into the Sunlight, War and Peace, Vietnam and America, October 1967. In it, David describes a 22-year-old Paul Soglin as more a disheveled high school prankster than the bohemian grad student Paul actually was. That, as they say, was then. So please join me in warmly welcoming tonight's panel, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much for coming. I don't remember calling Soglin that. I mean, there are many things you can call the guy, but in any case, I apologize for that one. What we have here are 3 lawyers and an idiot, and I'm happy to be the idiot in this case. And as I've said every year that we've done this, I'm truly honored to participate in this as a way to thank the Capital Times and the city for saving my father and my family during the Red Scare. It means so much to me that this happened. And part of the sensibility of the city was shaped by the university and its defining purpose, which was outlined first 129 years ago yesterday, September 18th, 1894, in defense of a socialist, sort of socialist professor, Ely. And it was written by the Board of Regents. I can't imagine some of the later versions of the Board of Regents writing this, but it's what we all live by, or try to. Whatever may be the limitations which trammel inquiry elsewhere, we believe that the great State University of Wisconsin should ever encourage that continual and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth can be found. This university hasn't always lived up to that foundational principle, as I know one of our panelists will make clear. But I'm curious, Chancellor Mnuchin, first of all, were you aware of this saying before you got here, and what does it mean to you?
I was aware of it. I was aware of the one-sentence version of it, to be honest. Like, I didn't even know before I got here that it came from the regents around an action and an attempt to discipline a professor, but I'd heard the phrase. It's a powerful phrase, and I associated it with Wisconsin somewhat the way I knew the idea of the Wisconsin idea, as a guiding principle for what this university wanted to be, and for a conception of academic freedom, and of the idea that it's through free inquiry, and it's through the ability to be driven by your curiosity and to pursue your pathway to truth, that we can produce knowledge and hopefully truth. One of the things I think that's interesting about it is, it's sifting and winnowing. There's going to be a lot of imperfections along the way. So it's, but it's a notion, really a sort of classic liberal conception of truth finding, that through that engagement, we will, over the long picture, get closer to truth, to knowledge, and to the ability to communicate with each other and make a difference in the world.
And how does it shape your daily activities as the chancellor?
Well, apart from the fact that I do repeat it from time to time, which I certainly grant, I think it is part of the fundamental conception of what we as a university should stand for. We haven't always perfectly, we probably won't always perfectly, but the idea that we want to be a place that supports free inquiry of those who are with us, especially our faculty and our students. It doesn't mean that I'll always say what's on my mind as a university administrator, but it's actually about protecting the spaces for teaching and learning and the spaces for research and knowledge production as places that deserve to be free of interference from me, interference from external forces, interference from legislators, interference from outsiders, interference from parents, to name just some of those, as spaces for legitimate engagements with knowledge production. I mean, that doesn't mean that a professor has the right to do absolutely anything they want in their classroom at any moment. But if it's in the name of a genuine effort to teach or engage or produce knowledge, we should create a very big and permissive tent.
Dan, I'm curious how you see that phrase connecting to the history of free speech on campuses.
Well, I'd like to focus on the portion of that quotation that you read, David, that we don't focus on quite as much. We talk a lot about sifting and winnowing, but there's that last part, through which alone truth can be found. And that very much connects with our over century-long tradition of protecting freedom of speech in this country. Again, not always perfectly, and sometimes the stated ideals don't always match what we're actually doing on the ground. But going back to these opinions from the World War I era, opinions written originally by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great Justice Brandeis, they're largely about the idea of pursuing truth as well as truth's centrality to participatory democracy, right? And the idea is that if you allow government a monopoly on truth, if you allow government to decide what can be said and what can't be said, we're not going to be able to have the rich mixture of ideas and the back and forth that is ultimately required in order to distinguish what's true from what's false. Now, having said all this, you look around the world today, and especially here in the United States, we've got a very clear truth problem. And there is this disjunction between the ideal of First Amendment theory and the on-the-ground reality that lies and disinformation are so frequently believed by large segments of the population.
Absolutely. Paul, it's your forum for telling us how the university has not lived up to that promise over the decades.
I think what we have to understand, particularly now, is that the battle is never ending, and that at least in terms of this institution, the record has been uneven over the years. In the 1950s, there were some instances during the era of red baiting, which curiously enough was not led by Joe McCarthy, but by other elements, where the university did not stand up. We could talk to Louise Trubeck and some other people about that. There was Stuart Hanish's video on open housing, where he went out with both white, mixed race, and black couples, made a video and made it very clear that landlords were discriminating in the housing world around Madison. He and Lloyd Barbie fought strenuously to get that video out, and the university censored it and would not allow the release of his documentary. In the 60s, there's issues involving race and certainly Vietnam. And curiously, one of the most outstanding cases, and it's merely an accident as to how my name's associated with it, but is Soglin v. Kaufman, in terms of a university's suppressing the rights of its students in free speech. As we go further on over the years, let me just say that at this juncture, despite that history, I think the situation is worse than ever. And one element of it is, or two elements, shall we say. One is there's historically been limited efforts at all levels of academics to censor what goes on in the classroom. That instructors, teachers, professors had the right to create their own curriculum, and that their value was judged on their teaching abilities, their research abilities, not on their political correctness. And now there's a move in this country at all levels of education to interfere with what goes on in the classroom, which is reminiscent of some of the worst characteristics of fascist states. Anybody who took a course from George Mossey would be well aware of that. The other element is one that's always been scary, which is the anonymous poster. And it used to be the posting anonymously of leaflets, the posting of placards. Now it's social media, where we've got incredible numbers of people, in some cases doing incredibly stupid things. So current as today, somebody posted that the coach of the New York Jets said that if they tried to replace Aaron Rodgers as quarterback for the team with Colin Kaepernick, he'd quit. It was totally fabricated, and the name of the coach wasn't even their real coach. But this kind of thing just takes off, and it gets larger and larger as it's repeated. And I think that's maybe not as great a threat to free speech as censorship itself, but it's certainly in the ballpark.
Yeah, we'll get back to all of those issues. And you mentioned the Trebecks who were in the law school, right, Dan?
Yeah.
And it was the Labor Youth League that they were organizing during the McCarthy era?
And there was a battle. David and Louise, who are distinguished emeritus members of our faculty, now living in New York City, they sent me a draft. I think it's a book chapter that they're working on regarding their experience, which I read before today's panel. And yeah, they were members of this left-leaning organization at a time when the university, through one of the university entities, was demanding membership lists. This was before the decision in NAACP versus Alabama, which said that at least for certain groups where people's safety and possibly their lives are in danger by disclosure of the fact that they're members, which was very much the case for the NAACP down in Alabama in the 1950s, and even here in Madison, Wisconsin, if it were widely known that someone was a member of a certain group, they could most definitely face repercussions. But that's what that battle was about. So not quite as dramatic, perhaps, as what the NAACP was facing down in Alabama, but a threat to freedom of speech nonetheless. And that's why, to some extent at least, anonymity, particularly with respect to membership organizations, remains protected to this day.
It's another issue, but it's also reminiscent of the special grand jury in Georgia, right?
Yeah.
Facing the repercussions. Chancellor Mnuchin, in your convocation speech, you said, "There's no doubt that freedom of speech is a heck of a lot easier to believe in when you agree with the speaker, but it's probably most important when you don't." Can you speak to that, and what prompted you to put that into your speech?
Sure. I mean, so freedom of speech has always been an idea about which there's been forms of ambivalence, even as we've celebrated it, as you've shared, and there's lots and lots of examples of this. But I certainly think this is another moment, not the only one, but we have our own current version where there are a lot of critics of free speech, a lot of people who are supportive of free speech in some circumstances, but don't believe that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So there's a lot of people who are big defenders of free speech when it comes to their ability to speak their truth. But when they hear things that they find deeply troubling, offensive, wrongful, even hateful, their reaction is to think that it needs to be silenced, not just condemned, because condemned is a form of speech, but silenced or canceled. And I think this is something we see politically right now. I mean, sometimes we see it on our campuses, we see it in the broader climate, where some of the same folks who are defending free speech rights in one arena think that somebody else shouldn't be allowed to speak at all because their speech causes harm. And, the thing about the First Amendment, I mean, Dan is really maybe you are as well, but Dan is certainly much more expert in the First Amendment than I am. I'm an evidence scholar, right? That's what I work on, especially evidence and science. But the thing about the First Amendment is it's really broad, and it doesn't protect all speech in all circumstances. But just because speech is offensive, harmful, even hateful, it's probably still protected. And if we believe that in aggregate we are better off having that liberty from the government being able to silence us for speaking our minds, then we need to try to apply that in an authentically even-handed way. There's a lot of people who say when confronted with speech that they find just dreadful, that's not free speech, that's hate speech. Mm-hmm. The tricky part is that under the First Amendment and under our nation's approach to this, things can be both.
And it's happened in this very room. I don't know how many hours I've sat here and listened to racists, George Wallace, Strom Thurmond, Pentagon officials, and the varying reactions were from heckling, which I see as acceptable, to somebody sitting in this room shouting out, "There is no free speech for war makers." That coming from somebody on the left directed at representatives of the Pentagon.
Where's the fine line there if they're actually trying to shut down the speech when they're heckling?
And that's the point, is that there is a distinction between, shall we say, disruption and shutting down that speech, no matter how obnoxious it is, which is why Nazis, American Nazis, can march in a predominantly Jewish suburb like Skokie, Illinois. It's offensive, it's disturbing. It would be particularly disturbing at that time from some of the many survivors of the Holocaust who still had tattoos on their arms, which they bore for the rest of their lives, the people who'd lost family and friends. But as disturbing and unnerving as that speech is, I'm fearful that when the left contributes to what we're seeing coming out of the right, we start losing the defenses that, in effect, preserve our democracy.
Yeah.
I think that's right, and it is important to recognize that the line between counter speech and shutting down a speaker, which is most definitely not protected, can often be a thin one. And we have some pretty good guidelines on this campus for distinguishing between the two and defining in what circumstances counter-protests cross the line into the disruption of speech.
I didn't know that. When were those written, and what do they say, basically?
The chancellor may know better than I. They've been in effect. I think they were written in 2017, if I recall correctly, around the time that the UW system adopted its current policy protecting freedom of speech and academic freedom on campus.
Because I know there were conservative legislators trying to impose certain guidelines like that went further, perhaps, than this does.
Yeah, and I think we've gotten the balance just about right. But of course, articulating a policy is one thing, and actually applying it and applying it even-handedly and faithfully is quite another.
And the other thing that's part of this is what's referred to as the chilling effect, which was a critical element in our lawsuit against the university, which was, in that case, the university rules were deemed to have a chilling effect, i.e., because they were so broad, because they were so vague, they threatened students in a manner that they might be then inhibited from exercising constitutionally protected rights of free speech. that chilling effect is what disturbed the courts the most. Nowadays, that chilling effect comes from so many different sources. The chilling effect can come from a student body that is threatening to make life miserable and even perhaps dangerous for an unwanted campus speaker. That's happened from California to Boston. It can come from a legislature, and we know that full well here in Wisconsin over the last several decades, a vengeful legislature who says, we're going to cut your budget if you do not. Would you know anything about that?
What? What?
We'll get
What
to
is
that
this
one.
thing of which you speak?
Yeah,
I can, but it comes from all those sources.
sure.
The other
It
thing,
also comes from social media.
and certainly from social media. But the other thing I think we have to understand is what is not protected free speech. There's that old phrase, free speech is free as long as you have your own press. And that partially is true. But the point is, those that do have media do not have an obligation to open that door to just any idiot, which seems to be the favorite sport these days.
So there are small, seemingly small issues that sort of encapsulate everything, and then there are really large issues. I'm not saying that racism is small, but the incident of last spring, which is kind of the elephant in the room here that you had to deal with, where there was a horribly vicious, vitriolic, racist rant that was posted on social media, and many of the students wanted you to expel the person who was responsible for it, and you had to react as the chancellor. Can you explain what process you went through thinking about it and how you explained it and dealt with it?
Sure. I mean, obviously, probably most of you in this room are aware of this. There was, as you said, just a viciously racist, horrible video that someone in our community said and then was posted by, I think, somebody else on social media, not by the speaker, and went viral. And it was a very painful, horrible video and unquestionably racist. The very hard thing is that it was also very clearly protected by the First Amendment. This was speech made by somebody in their own space. It wasn't actually spoken with the intent to send it out into the world. And while there are some narrow exceptions where speech isn't protected, those include things like true threats, where it's a direct and credible threat against a specific person, which, horrible though this was, it wasn't. It can include if the collection of speech acts add up to discriminatory harassment, but that takes really a lot of different things and much more than this. And so the fact that this was hateful and racist didn't mean it wasn't protected. That was a very painful thing for many in our community, and I think understandably. I think it felt to some like we were protecting the racist over our own students, and that's a very painful thing to experience it that way. Of course, that was in no way our intent. We are, for First Amendment purposes, a government agency. The First Amendment isn't actually a choice. For private institutions, how speech protecting they choose to be is more up to them. For us, the First Amendment applies directly to us. To say a silver lining is really, I think, the wrong phrasing, but the positive thing is that this horrible incident, I think, has begun a set of spaces for important conversations about race, about being Black on campus, about belonging, and about what we can do. We can't prevent speech acts. We can try to create a culture and a community where actions like this are hopefully extraordinarily rare, and are chilled by culture, right? Sometimes chilling effects are good things, where you can create a culture where just because things are legal doesn't mean that they're viewed as okay. There's lots of things that might be legal to do, but still aren't a good idea. But we can work to create a culture of belonging, but we cannot legally take punitive action against the speaker in an instance like that. And a lot of people really wish it were otherwise. But I mean, again, I'm not the First Amendment expert, but I did talk to a bunch of people who are, and not a one of them thought this was close.
Including
the-
Dan.
Yeah, so the video, let's all be very clear about this, was horrifying. It was racist, and it was deeply painful, especially for our Black students. It was very painful to hear a member of our community utter those horrible, hateful, racist words. But it was also protected speech. If the university had taken any kind of disciplinary action against the student for those words, and if I were still an ACLU lawyer, which I was for 9 years before becoming a law professor, I would have sued and I would have won, and it would not have been a close case. The university really wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. But there's something I want to focus on here. It has to do with the way that at least many of our students, particularly our more progressive students, think about freedom of speech, which is very different from the way I think all four of us and most of you in the audience probably do. You know, many of you grew up at a time when freedom of speech was essential to the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the protests against the war in Vietnam. That is how many of us think about freedom of speech. Jennifer and I were in college around the same time in law school, during the protests against the regime in South Africa and the protests against many universities' investment in South Africa. Our students today don't really have that context. And when they hear about freedom of speech, it's often our telling them why we can't do, truthfully, but telling them why we can't do what they want us to do, right? And so, I'm not at all saying they're right. I think I've pretty clearly said, at least on the First Amendment, they're wrong. But I think it is really important to recognize that our students today don't have the context that many of us older folks have with respect to freedom of speech and its centrality for those of us who care about achieving progressive social change.
I think you're getting to now starting us on the question of, or answering, how can we fix this? And it pains me to no end when I look at what we went through in terms of not just civil rights in the war, but also one of the ugliest chapters in the university's history, which was the repression against the gay community, which is well documented in Dick Wagner's 2 volumes. But where we went wrong, I think, and the left has something to blame for this, is starting sometime in the 1970s, when there was a movement in this country, and there still is continuation of it, not to require U.S. history and civics classes as the necessity for graduation from any level of institution. The history that many of us were taught was obviously badly flawed. And I don't think it's necessary to go into the fact that one of the most atrocious humans on the planet was Christopher Columbus. And that much of the Well, let me give you one example that I just recently been working on. So this country is founded, and we go through all of our difficulties. And what's one of the first things that happens before the 18th century ends? The home of the free, the land of the brave, adopts the first Naturalization and Immigration Act, designed to make it very difficult in 1796, I think it was, to become a naturalized citizen, basically to keep out the French aristocrats who were being beheaded back in Paris. But in any case, despite all of the misgivings we may have about that version of history, about men, and does it apply to our analysis of race, which is now also under attack with some of the stupidest television ads coming out this past week. Let's stop there. But anyway, my point is that despite the flaws in those classes, we were introduced to free speech. There was discussion of the Bill of Rights. And if you look at the number of hours that are spent in a classroom of somebody who's, say, 35 or 40 years old, or 20, compared to those of us who are over 40, it is a very significant difference. And that, I think, is where we went down the wrong path.
In some places that are teaching history are teaching bogus history.
Yes.
In Florida right now, for instance. What I see as the central point of tension at this particular university is the ideal of free speech versus this university's history, which is less than wonderful, about dealing with minority students. And that they're really at the point of this tension in the case last spring, but also in many other cases. And how do we get through that one?
Yeah, I think you are raising a really important issue, which is that free speech is critical, in my opinion, to the functioning of both our democracy and our university. And we need people to understand and embrace the idea of free speech and, frankly, engagement across difference, right? When you talk to people who disagree with you, it's not that they'll necessarily persuade you, not at all, but you will come to understand your own positions and arguments better. You will learn. I mean, this sounds like sifting and winnowing, right? But the idea that there is knowledge and better understanding of yourself produced by that engagement, I think, is at the heart of the educational enterprise. At the same time, I think it's also incredibly important to care about belonging and whether our students feel that they are part of our community, that this is a community for them. And there are both individuals and members of groups who struggle more to have that sense of belonging. Who walk onto campus. We have fourth generation Badgers, and we have students whose parents didn't graduate from high school. We have people that are part of the majority race, and we have lots of underrepresented minorities too. We have people who are LGBTQ, we have people who are rural, we have lots of folks whose identities and or beliefs may make them walk into this space either with a sense that, yes, this is Madison and it's for them, or with bigger questions about that. And when you don't have as strong a sense of belonging, and then you have these moments where somebody in a structural situation of some power, whether it's a professor or a guest speaker or an administrator or otherwise, says things that shake up your sense of that seem to you to be deeply, deeply harmful, it's easy to feel like, gee, maybe this isn't actually a place for me. And so that's a real problem. And yet we have to find ways to hold on to both.
Yeah. I love this university, and long before I became member of the faculty and the dean of the law school here 3 years ago, I thought this was a wonderful university. I admired it from afar. I've always, since the first time I visited here in 2002, loved Madison, and I've had a chance to travel around the state, and I think it's a wonderful state. It has always felt like a very friendly place to me. But we have to recognize, and I can't really see you all very clearly, but I'm going to guess that this is a predominantly white audience that I'm speaking to this evening. This does not always feel like such a friendly place to many of our students of color, to many of our Black and Latino and Native American students. You know, there is implicit bias here. I mean, the science shows that implicit bias exists and that it often affects our action. And it's certainly not something unique to Madison or Wisconsin, but it is a real thing. And it is very important that we as a university, as the chancellor and I try to do, work to make everyone feel welcome here. And that's going to take more work with some of our students than it does with others. It is why our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which are under attack right now, as we've all read, are so important, right? It's one thing to admit a diverse group of students who represent a wide range of identities, backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. It is quite another to make them all feel welcome here, to make them feel genuinely that they do belong, and to give them the resources that they need to succeed. But we're absolutely committed to doing that.
That sounds like a vice moving in on you, Chancellor. Yeah, on the one hand, you have African-American students who are curious about the defense of free speech for racists. On the other hand, you have the Assembly Speaker trying to cut funds unless you get rid of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
You know what? Worthwhile things are hard to do. If it were that, I mean, I don't mean to make light of it. Yeah, no, it's a challenging moment, and not just here, but I think across this country, right? I mean, I think to support both free speech and belonging in a time of intensely polarized politics, when there is, when many don't have much interest in thinking about those who think differently from themselves as decent people who think differently from themselves, right? There's a lot more polarization than that. And so that makes it challenging, but it also makes it incredibly important. I mean, I am also temperamentally somebody inclined to be open to talking across, including with those who don't always, you know, share my views and vice versa. And I do also think that's something that we need to put some effort into teaching as a skill. I don't think that people are I don't think our students arrive having had a lot of practice with it. Yeah. Most students go to high schools that are relatively demographically homogenous, not all, but most. And so for most students, when they come to college here or to any other large, reasonably diverse institution, they're going to be in a place with more people not like them than they've previously experienced. And so I think there's a real opportunity for us, and we're starting some, we have some things that we're already doing, and we have some things in the works to begin to invite those interested in the project of talking to people who aren't like them as a matter of identity or belief, to give them some exposure and practice in doing exactly that. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish. I don't think that, you can sit down and have a conversation and the world will suddenly be changed. But I do think that if we, I think about people like our faculty member, Kathy Kramer, whose book on the politics of resentment, I think is such a tremendous work, who in her own classes is inviting students to begin by asking them to think about the people that they grew up with and their political leanings, and what they would suggest that those came from a different perspective, would ask those people to try to understand a little bit better where they're coming from. And if we can start to create spaces where we try to understand before we throw the darts, maybe we can actually find a little more common ground.
Paul, you and I went to school here when the number of African-American students was pretty minimal. That's only increased somewhat since then, but how have you seen that issue play out in terms of free speech?
Well, let's go back to that period.
Yeah.
I mean, in the early and mid-'60s, I don't know this to be a fact, but my guess is that the majority of black students on campus were athletes.
Sure, Grape Juice Johnson was leading the strike.
All right, and then after the University of Alabama was integrated, I remember for quite a number of years that the University of Alabama had more African American students proportionally and in raw numbers than did the University of Wisconsin. And it has been very, very difficult for this institution, in particular, when you look at all the major state universities, all the land-grant schools, to get that racial diversity that would truly represent the state and the nation. The question, I think, is who's responsible for that? And I'll come back in a second on to what that means in terms of free speech. But the question of responsibility, we're back at the difficult situation that the UW is encountering right now with the threat of loss of tens of millions of dollars unless it cuts the diversity program. And it's a failure by political leaders on a statewide basis. Milwaukee has just been a total failure in economic, academic achievement for too many of its residents, many and most of whom are people of color. And this is not a recent event. This is going back years. The same situation has now expanded into communities like Beloit and Kenosha. Madison, we had the Race to Equity report. I've seen data recently which says that there's been some very significant changes in Madison since that time. But it's not, I don't know if I want to say solely, but it's not the university's responsibility to solve this problem, which is a political and economic problem involving the entire state. When I first came here in 1962, I was just shocked at some of the things I heard and witnessed in the dorms, which are on the level of the video that we've been talking about. White students who'd never been in the presence of a black person, and all they knew was basically the prejudice of their communities. There were heroic efforts, in part by Ruth Doyle when she had the responsibility. But it was an incredibly difficult and challenging task, because as we've seen also in the workplace, it's one thing to recruit somebody. It is very different to make them comfortable in that environment, whether it's academic or it's a place of employment or it's in terms of housing. I mean, the landscape is just littered with people who were recruited were isolated. And if you think about it, in effect, that isolation is a variant of free speech. Because here's where the cultural norms come into play. I want to use the exception to make the point. We're all familiar with Maple Bluff Country Club. It's about as white and as affluent as you can get in Dane County. And some of you may remember the name of Dan Neviser. And Dan was a member there. And there was an incident in the locker room where someone used the N-word. And Dan had the backbone and the courage and the values to call the person out about it. Well, what happened in the following days was other members of Maple Bluff came to him and criticized him for having been such a disruptive force in what he had done. There's got to be more of that, whether it is sitting in a bar, whether it's sitting in a classroom, it's sitting in a lounge. There has to be the will and the force to speak out and to use that free speech to challenge some very disturbing norms.
So I don't disagree, but I also want to complexify this and bring it back to campuses a little bit. Because I 100% agree that when there's racist speech of the sort that you described or the sort that we experienced last spring, that I think it needs to be called out for what it is, and there needs to be, it's a good thing when there's community condemnation of it. But I also think that that call-out culture dynamic is very complicated and has complicated effects at both extremes of the political spectrum, including on our campuses. And so, for example, last spring, I think, at the University of Chicago, there was an incident that got a fair amount of attention where somebody was teaching a course, and it was a course that had a title and a frame that was offensive to some conservatives who thought it was, I guess, too woke, right? And a student called that out and disrupted it, and on social media gave the name of the instructor and her email address and the like, all of which was publicly available information on the University of Chicago's website. The university stood behind the professor's right to teach this, right? The university did not in any way infringe upon her academic freedom or her ability to teach this course. But because this was on social media in this way, the teacher experienced significant threats and emails and a lot of pretty challenging things. And I think, I don't remember all the facts of this one, but I think this was, either a junior professor. I mean, it was also somebody relatively early in their academic period. And so, I mean, what's challenging about this is that, in these, that same dynamic that you've described, that we absolutely need to kind of enforce culture and social norms and decency, also gets sometimes weaponized in ways that harm the ability to engage in academic study and dialogue across difference. And I mean, some of my former colleagues at UCLA Law School were the recipient of this kind of dynamic as well. And I'm sure there are examples here. So it's really, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to describe is it's a tough ecosystem, and in some ways, the rules of the road that I think were created for a time when, there wasn't social media and this ability to pile on in such dramatic and potentially national ways. And I guess I'd love to hear what Dan thinks about how do we think about these issues in the wake of new technologies and new ways of engaging?
I think it's a huge challenge. And, our First Amendment doctrine developed, really started to develop about 100 years ago and then continued to develop through the second half of the 20th century. And without getting too much into the weeds, the basic standard is to prosecute someone for incitement. You have to show that there's an imminent threat of some serious harm, and you have to show, for criminal charges at least, an intent to cause that imminent harm. That's basically the clear and present danger test, which found its fullest statement in the Brandenburg case, late 1960s. It's a really high standard. But there are a lot of things that go on in social media today where somebody's not directly inciting, as the First Amendment requires, not making a direct threat, but that tweet or that post can take on a life of its own, often with the knowledge, or at least the foreseeability on the part of the original tweeter, that that's what's going to happen, and cause really genuine threats to someone's life and safety, and cause an enormous amount of fear and anxiety. And anybody who's been subjected to a realistic death threat, I'm guessing you probably have at some point in your life, probably the chancellor I have, knows that's really scary. It's really scary when someone makes a realistic threat on your life. Jocelyn Benson was talking about that here on this stage last year. The Secretary of State in Michigan, some of the threats she's received as a really great and conscientious election official. And so I think our free speech law is still catching up. There's an important decision from the Supreme Court that came down this past term, Counterman versus Colorado. It involves a local musical artist who was basically being stalked by someone online and saying things that were not directly threatening or not explicitly threatening, but would be perceived as threatening, I think, by most people. He was just like persistently, trying to contact this artist, a woman, through social media. And the court articulates, I think, probably the right test, borrowing from New York Times versus Sullivan, the famous defamation case, and one of the greatest decisions, in my opinion, that the Supreme Court has ever written, saying you don't have to show an intent in those kinds of cases. What you have to show is reckless disregard for whether it would be perceived as threatening. And so I think that's probably about the right balance between, on the one hand, protecting freedom of speech, and on the other hand, protecting people from words that might genuinely be perceived realistically as threatening and make one fearful for one's life or safety.
The Sullivan decision, which might be endangered again.
Yeah.
With the Supreme Court.
I hope not.
Yeah.
This actually, the fact that the courts, and a majority of the court, including some of the conservatives, so prominently cited New York Times versus Sullivan in this recent decision, gives me some reason to believe that, at least for the moment, New York Times versus Sullivan, a great opinion by Justice William Brennan, is safe. And it's an opinion that famously articulated this vision of freedom of speech, which is a noble one, that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, and may sometimes include vehement and caustic attacks on public officials, people like us, and later extended to public figures, people like you, David. And that's the price that we pay for living in a democratic society. But it shouldn't be a price you have to pay to have to fear for one's life as a result of something that someone tweets out to the world.
Getting back to the ecosystem within the campus, one of the other issues that you've sort of touched on, but not quite directly, involves the sensitivity of students today and the use of, the fear of trigger words that can make them uncomfortable. Dan, how do you deal with that issue?
Yeah, well, I do think there are circumstances where a teacher is well advised to give some notice and some prefatory words to their class before engaging in a sensitive subject. An example is in a criminal law class where we discuss rape and sexual assault. I mean, there's a good chance in a large class, in fact, a high probability, that someone in that classroom has been the victim of rape. And I do think it is appropriate for a teacher in those circumstances to acknowledge that and urge people to be sensitive in how they speak with one another. At the same time, we are, especially in a law school, we're training people to make reasoned arguments. And that sometimes means hearing things that you find morally objectionable, offensive, deeply wrong. And we all know that feeling, I get it in the pit of my stomach to this day when I hear an argument that just makes my blood boil. But one of the things about being lawyers, and I don't think it's just us lawyers, but we have to learn to take a deep breath and find a way to muster evidence and reasoned arguments rather than just shrinking back. I mean, that's a big part of what not just legal education, but education in general is for. But I don't want to understate the difficulty of doing that, especially if you're a student who is in the minority, be it in terms of your ideological beliefs or in terms of your race or ethnicity, in a classroom where you may be very fearful about how your fellow students are going to react to what you say. I mean, that fear is very real, but it is something that we have to prepare our students to work through.
Yeah, I would largely agree with Dan. I mean, I think that when classrooms work well, especially discussion classes, they create enough trust over time that you can talk about difficult things in ways that don't leave you feeling unmoored or with that pit in the middle of your stomach. But it's important to recognize that education does sometimes, that the process of thinking about hard things sometimes makes you uncomfortable. And that doesn't mean that we're going about it wrong. At the same time, it can be absolutely human decency to give people a sense of what's coming so that they can ready themselves and gird themselves, especially if it's an area that is especially sensitive for them, or if they really need to absent themselves from that space. But hopefully that latter move will be pretty rare. I mean, I was an evidence professor. I haven't taught it in some years, but when you teach evidence, you do teach rape shield as one element of that. Mm-hmm. And when I did that, I did always give my students a sense that it was coming. I did say that if anyone really felt like they couldn't be there for that class, they could watch the recording. Very few people took me up on that. But then I asked, when we began the class, I always said, I want you to do two things in this space. I want you to remember that there are people in this room who have been the victims of sexual assault. And I want you to speak with a recognition that some of your classmates, possibly many of your classmates, have had that experience. I also want you to understand that we're in a law school classroom where we need to probe ideas and explore their limits. And so our goal will be to try to have a class that recognizes both of those. I didn't think I was doing that because my students were weak or snowflakes or unable to engage in robust, meaningful conversation. But I also thought that if we named why this conversation was going to be harder and more personal for some of the people in the room than others, we were actually creating a bit of scaffolding that would let us have a meaningful class.
I also think we ought to realize that this conversation is also to be extended into the sciences and the arts. In some places you cannot use the phrase climate change or global warming. We've encountered it here at the university. regarding DNA stem cell research. So those are just a couple of examples in the sciences. But we also see it in the arts as well. And my recollection is there's nobody like a 23-year-old artist who enjoys nothing more than being provocative and offending as many people as possible.
Was that you at age 23?
I remember what my friend Sam Brown said. Never offend with style when you can offend with substance. But I just have to mention one of my favorite free speech cases, which was lost on the side of justice. And that was a high school student who, because it was a school-sponsored event, ended up being subject to discipline. And the Olympic torch was moving up the West Coast. And I can't remember if he was in Oregon or Seattle. But in any case, he was either somewhere in the Northwest. And he held up a banner which said, "Bong hits for Jesus." Some people are still trying to figure out what that means. But in any case, the court ruled that because it was a school event and because high school students do not have the same privileges and rights as college students, that he was subject to discipline. I said at the time, I hope he ends up becoming a professor and teaching your children. And he did.
That's great. I have 10 more questions, and there are plenty more from the audience, although I tried to incorporate those into some, but I thought we could close, Jennifer, with, I remember a few years ago that sort of in the effort to diversify thought on the campus when it was thought to be too liberal, that the big red read was Hillbilly Elegy, which I thought was a fraud from the beginning and was really disappointed in that choice. Sort of a naive effort by liberals to make it seem like they were showing something, positive feelings about it. But I'm very delighted by the choice you made this year. David Maraniss, How Minds Change. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that relates to what we've been talking about tonight?
Sure. Just a preview that all of you should read the book and come to that event later this fall. I was very interested in trying to find a book that would relate to this set of questions broadly conceived, not necessarily about free speech per se and the First Amendment, but how we think about the world, what actually leads us to change our minds, and it's a little disappointing for me as an evidence scholar to learn that most of the times our minds don't change because of evidence, because of careful, disciplined argument, although I think sometimes in academic settings that can happen. But as much from learning to create spaces for listening and respect, and openness for a moment where people might be open to change. This book looks at all kinds of spaces, ranging from those who believe conspiracy theories that many of us in this room might not, to lots of other kinds of beliefs. And what do we actually know about the science of what leads people to potentially change their own minds? And I'm going to invite all of you to think about things that you once believed and now don't, and to reflect on what was it that began to make you open to thinking that maybe the condition of the world was different than what you thought it was? So I asked for nominations from across campus and got a range of them, and then there was a committee that selected a subset of books and gave me 4 or 5 from which to choose. And I from that group of finalists, I picked this one. And I'm very excited for a conversation that I think does connect to these questions in this moment, but not in a wildly literal, precise way, but in a space that will open up a set of engagements and conversations across campus, or at least that's what I hope for. So come join us.
Well, that's great, and that's what the Idea Fest is all about. So thank you very much, all three of you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.